The first Battleship Texas is a ship that is often overlooked. This is because of her far more famous successor, the ship currently in drydock, as well as because of her contemporary, the USS Maine, which is more well known for blowing up. These two ships overshadow Texas in almost every way, a fact not helped by a quiet service history, aside from a stint in the Spanish-American War. In the end, Texas would be renamed and expended as a target, not even allowed to retain her own name. A sad fate for an important ship for American naval development. Even if she was obsolete, or obsolescent at best, when she entered service. Which does, of course, raise the question of exactly how such an important ship ended up obsolete upon commissioning. I will cover that first, and then look at how she fared in the Navy. First, to understand Texas, you have to understand the position the United States Navy was in during the 1880s. I went over this before in my video on USS New York, the armored cruiser, not the battleship. The same statements in that video apply here. In the 1880s, the Navy was an underfunded mess, relying primarily on Civil War holdovers. And even those were often in barely serviceable condition. And that's ignoring, for the moment, the issue with trying to sail a monitor across an ocean if the need arose. As well as assuming any were actually able to sail at all, which was not a given, considering up to half the ships in the Navy were not fit for service at any given time. The United States Navy had gone from second only to the Royal Navy to rusting hulks and old wooden-hulled steamers. It was definitely not a pretty sight. And it also prompted, in the early 1880s, the move to the New Navy, as it was called. This began with the ABCD ships, USS Atlanta, USS Boston, USS Chicago, and USS Dolphin. The former three were protected cruisers, while Dolphin was a dispatch ship. Those cruisers proved to be good ships, and a fine foundation to build upon. To build upon that foundation, the Navy looked at further armored ships. Enter USS Texas and USS Maine, or the ships that would become them at any rate. Now, the Navy was initially reluctant to build battleships, even for the new Navy. They weren't suited for commerce raiding, and everyone involved knew that trying to compete with European powers was a non-starter. Even so, studies for a small battleship did begin to pick up in the background, if nothing else. And then came 1883 and the delivery of the Riachuelo to Brazil. It is difficult to say if that battleship is what truly prompted the ordering of battleships for the United States Navy, although it certainly had some impact. The background discussions moved to the foreground, with a side of, probably overstated, panic about Brazil having a stronger navy. When you have a congressman saying that Riachuelo could single-handedly defeat the entire United States Navy, you know things are getting a bit silly. Even if it isn't necessarily wrong, at least in regard to how much the Navy had slumped by that point. In any event, in 1884, the Navy started to draw up requirements for a pair of modern armored warships. A battleship of 7,500 tons, and an armored cruiser of 5,000 tons. These were intended to be broadly similar ships, with the battleship armed with 4 10-inch rifles, and the armored cruiser with 2 of the same weapon, as well as smaller 6-inch guns for a secondary battery. In the end, though, neither of these designs would go forward. Instead, the Secretary of the Navy elected to go for the middle ground between them. A new maximum tonnage of 6,000 tons, with the battleship moving to 2 12-inch guns and the armored cruiser to 4 10-inch guns. While the cruiser, what became USS Maine, was designed by American hands, the battleship USS Texas came from a British design. She would be built in an American yard, but the design was British. That made her the very, very rare case of a United States Navy warship designed by a foreign shipbuilder. In any case, with that design in hand, Texas was finally laid down on June 1st, 1889. Even at that point, her design was arguably outdated. Delays in her construction almost immediately began. These issues ranged from the expected difficulty of moving forward decades in design practice to problem sourcing armor plate. Because of these delays, Texas would only be launched on June 28, 1892. She wouldn't commission into the fleet until August of 1895. For sake of comparison, the Royal Navy was operating the Royal Sovereign class pre-dreadnought, and the Majestic class was well into their construction as well, with two of the class only a couple months out from completion. As could be expected, Texas was rather outmoded by this point. Displacing 6,300 or so tons, Texas was admittedly a far smaller ship. Even with that, though, she had anachronistic design choices that made her less capable than her tonnage indicated. I'll get into those after I cover her design. To begin, USS Texas carried two 12-inch rifles mounted in single turrets. These were supported by 6 secondary guns. 4 6-inch rifles fitted to hull-mounted casements with 2 on either broadside. The remaining 2 6-inch rifles were fitted in single mounts, one on the forward end of the superstructure and the other on the aft end. Past that, the remainder of her weaponry was fairly typical pre-dreadnought fare. 12 6-pounder guns were fitted in casements of their own for anti-torpedo boat protection. These were, in turn, matched by a smattering of 1-pounder guns in the superstructure. 4 revolving guns on the main superstructure level, and 2 more traditional guns in each fighting top. Texas also carried the usual torpedo tubes, but in her case they were above water instead of submerged. She carried 4 14-inch tubes, 1 in the bow and stern, and 1 on either side of the hull. Now, to round out her technical details, the ship was fitted with a fairly heavy armor belt, 12 inches at its thickest, of Harvey steel. This protected her machinery spaces while thinning down to 6 inches at its lower edge. A further 12-inch armored citadel of sorts protected the turret machinery and the base of the conning tower. To bring this section to an end, Texas was capable of 17.8 knots on 2 shafts. With 8,600 indicated horsepower through those shafts, she was able to exceed her design speed of 17 knots, which is about the only area where Texas exceeded expectations. As I'll get into, starting with her main battery. As said, her 2 12-inch guns were mounted in a pair of single turrets. These were, in turn, mounted en echelon, with 1 on either side of the ship. This was a direct result of the Navy wanting as much end-on fire as humanly possible, instead of having a more traditional layout with 1 turret on the bow and 1 on the stern. While that would allow for a proper 2-gun broadside, it also meant that only 1 gun could be used when chasing or being chased. This may seem like a strange decision, considering how much it limited a more traditional broadside engagement, but this was a time when ramming was still considered a viable option, at least in theory. Even with a minimal superstructure, the guns were left with a very slim arc of fire where they could be used together on the broadside. With an important distinction here, that even this ran the risk of damaging that superstructure. Even in completely perfect conditions, that risk remained. It wasn't as if end-on fire was much better, as the blast effect from that could damage the ship's deck, which meant that even the intended reason for the design was something of a bust. Not to mention the fun time explaining the damage to dockyard workers when you return to port. But by the time the Navy recognized the issue with this, Texas was too far along in construction to change things up, so they were stuck with a less than ideal main battery layout. There was still some consideration towards changing her design to a more traditional, to modernize, layout of 2 single turrets on the center line, but it went nowhere. There were other flaws with these turrets as well. They were limited to loading at only 2 angles, either on the center line or directly abeam. That sharply limited the ship, as she had to return her guns to those angles if she wanted to fire more than 1 salvo. Although this was apparently modified to all-angle loading right before the Spanish-American War. A further issue in her design related to her armor protection. Texas carried no light armor, which made her exceptionally vulnerable to rapid-fire guns. Granted, this was not an issue in the mid-1880s, But by the mid-1890s, that was another story entirely. And Texas was most assuredly not designed according to the all-or-nothing principle, so flooding from 1,000 paper cuts was a very real threat. Those are the major issues with her design, though, so with that done, I'll cover her service history now. Such as it is, because aside from a stint beating up on Spain, Texas saw little action. As said earlier, Texas was commissioned in August of 1895. This was a tad optimistic, which is sad to say after her lengthy construction process. Sea trials revealed multiple structural issues in Texas's design, which required serious refit work. Serious enough that the Navy outright formed a committee in January 1896 to figure out how to fix them. These modifications, largely focused on reinforcing the battleship's structural integrity, would prove to be a good idea. After all, she began a trend of running aground, repeatedly. The first of these happened off the coast of Rhode Island in September of 1896. Repair work for this should have been fairly quick, as the damage wasn't severe. However, while under repair in New York, the ship contrived to flood at her dock. A pipe broke in her engine room, which promptly flooded. With her watertight doors proving anything but watertight, this flooding spread throughout the entire battleship. Texas promptly settled on the bottom on November 9, 1896. Not exactly a great start. That said, repairs to that were completed in relatively short order. She then set off to join the North Atlantic Squadron in February of 1897, which does go to show how quick the repairs to her flooding damage were. However, because bad luck rarely gives up easily, Texas would end up running aground while at anchor. Yes, really. She moored in Galveston, Texas on February 16th, where a strong wind and tide forced the ship onto a mudbank. She was so caught in the mud that it took a tug the next day to get Texas out again. I suppose if she was going to run aground, at least it was in her namesake state. That said, with sailors always being a superstitious lot, Texas had now picked up a reputation as an unlucky ship, or an outright cursed one, to the point she was nicknamed Old Hoodoo. Fortunately, though, the bad luck seems to have run its course. The rest of 1897 and early 1898 were quiet times for the battleship. She served in the Atlantic and Caribbean, barring a break to remove her bow and stern torpedo tubes, as well as the fitting of telescopic sights to her turret roofs, which would soon come in handy. Because in February of 1898, USS Maine, the ship ordered alongside Texas, blew up in Havana Harbor. By April, Spain and the United States were at war. During this conflict, Texas would largely stick to the waters around Cuba. In May of 1898, she joined blockade duty off the Cuban coast. She would remain there until June 16th, when she bombarded a Spanish fort in Guantanamo Bay. Returning to blockade duty at that point, Texas would next engage the Spanish on July 3rd at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. In spite of her outdated and clunky main battery, Texas would prove quite capable at this engagement. Her main battery took the Spanish cruisers under fire, while her secondary guns fired on Spanish destroyers. The fire from Texas, in conjunction with the rest of the American fleet, wrecked the Spanish formation. In turn, Texas only took a single 6-inch high explosive shell to her upperworks. This did very little damage, especially when one thinks about the damage Texas did to the Spanish fleet. With the Spanish fleet in the New World destroyed, however, Texas was suddenly out of things to do. She eventually returned to American waters with the end of the war and took up peacetime duties once more. Peacetime duties that would turn out to be short-lived. First, she was given a long and very necessary refit. This lasted from November 1900 to November 1902. This 2-year refit saw her funnel and topmasts raised, the protection of her ammunition hoists doubled, and the removal of her broadside torpedo tubes, leaving her with only her guns. What this refit does not seem to have done is improve her propulsion. By 1904, Texas was barely able to make 14 knots under forced draft. This isn't a surprise with her increasing age, but it was also not a great sign of things to come for the battleship. Even so, the Navy wasn't quite ready to give up on her. That same year, Texas had her hull-mounted 6-inch guns replaced. The new weapons were more powerful 6-inch .35 caliber rifles, which increased their range and hitting power. It was a sign that Texas still had some life in her, although, as it would turn out, not much more life at all. Because this was something of a stopgap measure at best. The next year, HMS Dreadnought would be laid down, rendering Texas even more obsolete than she already was. With many much more capable battleships in service, or in the design phase, Texas was taken off active duty by 1908. She became a station ship in Charleston and would remain there for the remainder of her career. A career that would only last 3 more years. In 1911, the Navy decided they would get more use out of Texas as a gunnery target instead of as a station ship. She certainly wasn't fit for even second-line combat duty by that point, and hadn't been for a decade. As a gunnery target, she could, at least, be used to test the impact of modern shells on a decently modern target. So it was that in February of 1911, USS Texas lost her name. She was renamed San Marcos to free the name up for the new dreadnought then under construction. That USS Texas, of course, remains around to this day. As for San Marcos, she was towed out to Chesapeake Bay on March 21, 1911. Once there, she was subjected to gunfire from the pre-dreadnought USS New Hampshire. The resultant damage would demolish her upper works and riddle her with holes beneath the waterline. This would ultimately sink her, although it was in shallow water. Shallow enough that she could be used for further tests, resting on the bottom. A torpedo experiment on April 6th of the same year being the first. And then in 1912, a cage mast, similar to those aboard the Florida class, was stuck on her sunken hulk. This was then fired upon to test the durability of the cage mast design. Further gunnery practice would, off and on, continue through World War II. By that point, though, San Marcos was generally only used as an anchor point, not the actual target. Though the old battleship would get a measure of revenge, if you want to look at it that way. In 1940, her rusting hulk sank a cargo ship. This prompted the Navy to demolish her upper works with explosives, to drive her into the mud and remove that risk. What little remains of her is still there to this day. And thus does the story of the first battleship of the United States Navy come to a close. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.